Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you each week as we lay the groundwork for ourselves and our communities and our dreams. This week's guest really inspired me. I found her work right towards the end of the year, something I talked a little bit about in a solo episode a couple of weeks back, and it really helped inform my process for how I thought about setting myself up for the new year. Dr. Julia Skinner is our guest today, and she is an incredible polymath. She has a PhD in library sciences and a specialty in library history. She is a fermenter galore of all things fermented, and her book, Our Fermented Lives, is one of the most beautiful little dives that marries history and recipe and culture and community and health all into one really fantastic package. Julia is a writer and a writing coach and someone who has thought a lot about how to build holistic ecosystems for creative work, something we dive really deep into today. She also has an incredible oracle deck and gives beautiful oracle readings. There is nothing that this woman can't do. And I think that will be abundantly clear as you dive into this episode. I so enjoyed getting to talk about creative practice with Julia. I'm focusing a lot this year on how I strengthen my creative practice and my relationship to my creative practice and find even like what that process looks like for me. And so it was actually quite selfish of me to bring Julia on so that I could explore this. Julia has an incredible number of resources on her Substack and her website, and she even has some groups where you can explore your creative process in a group setting and various different levels of coaching, and so I encourage everyone to check that out. This is a little bit of a pet project for me right now to explore creative process and how to make space for it, how to give it any boundaries that it needs, and how to find what works for me. And so I think that this is something we're going to explore a lot more of on the podcast. What struck me in this episode, though, was as we explored a lot of individual practice, so much of this became about the greater community. And I think that Julia really speaks to what it is to build community as a whole. There was a little quote that I don't think I got to read on the episode where in her book, Our Fermented Lives, she says, "Food sits at the intersection of the self and the other. What we create and share is consumed and absorbed by the individual body, but it took many, many sets of hands to get it there. Those that planted and raised the seed, those that brought the food to market, and those that prepared it, among many others." One of the things that struck me in preparing for this interview was how often I found Julia's words about fermentation applicable to creative practice and work. And I think that, if you've listened to any of my previous episodes, that I really believe that food is that space between self and other that is constantly cycling. But I think that this might actually be true of creative work as well. And as I did a lot of reading in the year 2023, I think that there is this moment where we absorb work, whether that's writing, whether that's art, whether that's music, as an intersection of self and other, and oftentimes of community. And I think that same thing happens when we share our artwork, our writing, our food, whatever that creative practice is for you with the world. Again, we're interacting outside of those boundaries of self as we take these things in and they become a part of us. They become part of our garden of knowledge, part of our garden of thoughts. And I think that in in concert, this is what creates a rich ecosystem of care and community and creation, and is part of what it means when we look to reimagine the world that we're in, which is something that Julia and I dive into. And one of the most important things that I took away from this episode was how important play and celebration are within that we have to access these creative talents, these gifts that are inherent in us, and enjoy them in order to make this a practice. And it really struck me because I don't think I was enjoying some of these things that I consider gifts. And this also helped me realize that the podcast is absolutely a part of my creative space, and it is something that I find so fun and joyful. And so thank you for being here in one of my creative works, and something that has just been an incredible gift to produce over the last, I guess we're coming up on 2 years, even though kind of took a little hiatus last year. I really encourage you to seek out Julia's work and her words. There's lots of links in the show notes for all the places that you can find Julia, and she's encouraged everyone to reach out to if you don't see something that fits for you. I can't wait to dive more into creative process with all of you this year. I am just really excited about our slate of guests. And so if you enjoy this podcast, I encourage you to leave a rating and review, to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear some of these deep dives that we have coming up on the podcast. It really helps support my creative work as this is something that I am creating and putting out into the world, and it is just little old me over here for all of the content creation and the many hours that I spend preparing for these podcasts, the editing, the marketing, the whole kit and caboodle is me. And so I deeply appreciate your support. And I just want to get into this interview with Dr. Julia Skinner. So without further ado, here is Julia. I always tell my audience this, but starting podcasts is the hardest part. And I feel that sometimes hitting that record button really changes your sense of being in the world,
Right.
in the digital world. But I wanted to start this out, and I wanted to tell you because you really inspired a lot of my thinking, and we find ourselves, for listeners, here on January 2nd. You really inspired a lot of my thinking about how I wanted to go about even considering my new year. And it was such a pleasure to be in your work, both in terms of exploring fermentation, but also exploring creative practice that really, really got my wheels turning. So I wanted to thank you at the outset for that.
Well, thank you. That's a lovely piece of feedback about my work to hear.
Your work is spectacular, and it is truly and deeply inspiring. But I think one of the things that I really found as I was reading through, especially some of your ideas around crafting creative practice, was that you have a real gift for finding this fine balancing act between gentleness and commitment and goal setting. And you have the most acute and deep understanding of the sort of little hiccups and road bumps that can derail really sensitive, creative people, of which maybe I am one of them. And while sort of validating a lot of those feelings and the sense of being a creative person in the first place. And so it's just you really have a gift for speaking to that space.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that it's interesting you bring that up because right before we started talking, I was actually working kind of in another aspect of my work on that very thing. So I'm also so a lot of where I get that comes from being a writing coach and comes from years of like helping people who are creatives, like both witnessing my own creative practice and the ways that that ebbs and flows and, you know, the sorts of hiccups that come with it. And the very self-critical, self-talk that can that can accompany not doing enough or not doing it right, or, what happens when you get derailed and, whatever. But because I've been doing writing coaching for so long, I feel like it's been very affirming for me to see that that's a thing that we all do, and it isn't just, that there's something wrong with me as a creative, or, whatever. It's like, oh, we all have these ways of engaging. Yeah, and it was interesting to then apply that to my culinary practice and like notice where I started doing that as a fermenter, as, a cook, like in general, and seeing the ways that some of my like self-talk and some of my like desire to experiment, but then for some reason holding back, or,
Mm.
whatever the case may be, like translated to cooking spaces.
Mm. So when I was building this, I always build these little outlines that you'll see me look at over here. And as I was building it, I couldn't believe the amount of crossover I found between the art of fermentation and the idea of cultivating or culturing a creative practice. That there were all of these crossovers. And so as
Mhm.
you speak to that, and I know this as a chef and as a butcher, right? That sometimes those crafts that are more done with our hands
Mhm.
can cross inform, that we learn things about ourselves in both spaces that can talk to one another. But I think your work speaks to that in a deeper way, and I hope that we're gonna tease out some of those
Yeah.
little crossovers and those Venn diagram center
Mhm.
areas. But tell me first, just a little bit for our listeners too, how you came to this intersection, because you really do sit at the intersection of culturing and cultivating food and creative practice both.
Yeah, so a lot of it comes from just having a really diverse background professionally and personally. Like a lot, like I have always been very, very resistant to being pigeonholed into one particular career or activity. It is not how I work, and I've been repeatedly told throughout my life that like, no, you have to like pick a thing. You have to pick a research area, and you have to pick a whatever. And I'm just like, no, that's not, like, my brain does not function that way. Um and so, was told repeatedly, like, oh, well, now you're never going to get a job as a faculty member. Well, you're not going to ever, whatever. And was repeatedly told the way that that was a shortcoming. But of course, it's not, because the life that I've built is so joyful and so enriching in a way that, if I had been like, I only study the history of libraries and that's all I do, which is great. Like, it's not a dig at that. I've done that research and I absolutely love it. But it just doing just that would have been stifling. And so, in my background, so to back up a little bit about the history of libraries, so my PhD is in library science, and I studied the history of libraries primarily.
Mm.
But I also, have had all of these other experiences. I've driven buses, I've worked in restaurants. I now own two different businesses. I'm, a writer. Like, I don't know, I make art. I do like wander out in nature and like talk to plants, like a lot of different things. But yeah, like that intersection really comes from that refusing to be pigeonholed, and
Mm.
that just like saying yes to various things without maybe having clarity about how they're going to fit into the larger whole like picture, but knowing that like I'm feeling really like guided to do this right now. I don't know why, but we're going to go with it.
This is something that's come up a lot on the podcast. I don't know if you've read, I think his name is David Epstein. I always forget his first name. We can look it up, but he wrote a book called Range about generalists. And so, this
Mm.
idea of being a generalist where you have all these many interests and you don't always know how they're going to come together in one space. And this is something I've struggled with my whole career. And I think people that have a lot of interests and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of passions and are easily lured down various different rabbit
Mm-hmm.
holes. And I think you said something really crucial there. You don't always know how all of that is going to come together. But I think
Mm-hmm.
that there can be this aspect of believing that if you're following some of this joy, some of this passion, some of the ways that you feel lit up in the moment by things that might feel disparate or complementary, that
Mm-hmm.
that they do come together in ways that you
Yeah.
never could have expected.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I like that last sentence you said of like that they really do. Like the ways that those intersections happen are very surprising. And like I never would have thought that like being a bus driver would have like benefited like when I was a like I was a professor and when I like teach classes, right?
Mhm.
Like but it did because you're working with people who maybe are very different from you. Like the general public who gets on a bus is like just whoever gets on the bus. It's not like you really get to like self-select who's there.
Definitely not.
Um and you also have to learn a lot of patience because not everybody is going to be easy to work with in that space. And so it ended up really translating in like some useful ways. But yeah, like at the time, like when I was like, for some reason, I feel like I need to be a bus driver. And then I was a bus
Mm,
driver. Like I didn't know that like that was going to help me be a better teacher. Like I had no idea.
no. What a beautiful thing. I have to I missed this part of your backstory. And so I need to tease at this a little bit because this is a really beautiful thing. I mean, a bus is such an intersection of culture. I mean, it's such a mix and
Hmm.
I mean, a place where we find ourselves where we have not I mean, the only self-selection is that we need to get from point A to point B
Yeah.
and using that. So that's fascinating. And you felt called to do this.
Yeah, it's they had an opening for a job and I was like, "Huh, looks interesting." And I was like, "I'm gonna do it." And all my family and friends were like, "Why would you go and drive a bus? Like, why would you do that?" And I was like, "I don't know, it just sounds cool." And, and so I did. And then I drove buses the last like 2 years of my undergrad and then all through my master's program. And yeah, it was a very fun job. It was interesting because it was a bus company. It's public transit, like free public transit, but it's run through the university. So it was like students who were driving the buses, obviously like trained and with CDLs, like people who are
Yes.
qualified to
Yes.
drive buses, but who are also students. And but then, like then the general public, so you kind of have, I think when you work at a university, it's very easy for you to not really interact with people outside of that in the course of your workday. And so it was interesting to work for a university, but then have the people I'm actually interacting with be not not the people at the university. So it was very nice. Like one thing I appreciated about that and it kind of brings to mind a promise I told myself when I started my PhD was this idea that like I will never become so disconnected from like the rest of my community that I can't talk to them about my work.
Yes. Cool.
Because when I started my PhD, I was very aware that like sometimes, and I love academics very much. Obviously, am one, have been one, but there are many people who like just are so used to communicating just in that space that like talking with other people and like if somebody asks like what do you do, they don't want me to explain like, the intricacies of like the social media study I'm currently doing or whatever. Like they just want to know like, oh, I research social media in libraries or whatever. Like that's it. That's all they need. And like, um and so yeah, that was I think driving the bus really helped me with that because I
Mm.
was never really like fully within that space where I would have been able to kind of develop those blinders.
I love that, and I work some in academia and definitely speak to a lot of people in academia, and I think that we risk, and I think one of the beautiful things about exploring fermentation as a metaphor for community and for culture as a
Hmm.
whole is that there are so many connection points and they're talking to each other and it can never be siloed. And I think
Yeah.
that sometimes knowledge in academia can get caught in this little silo and where you're only talking to one another and it doesn't
Hmm.
have this robust and rich interaction with the communities, even the communities that they're studying and that they're working with, and
Yeah.
just how much that can counter influence everything and find a little bit more richness within a space.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's I think that you especially see that in some of the more like traditional disciplines that have a very long standing history. In library science, it's interesting because it's kind of inherently an interdisciplinary space. You have, so like in my research, I did do like some social media based research. Like I did do historical, deep dives into archives. Like I did a bunch of different things because it all falls under the study of information, which is like, okay, well, that's everything. So you can like, so then how do you approach it? And yeah, it was very nice because I had like under the auspices of this field and this kind of way of approaching, thinking and research, you then had all these different subject areas that seemed like they wouldn't match. You'd have people studying like medical informatics, and you'd have people studying like, library history, and then like, building library collections, or, you know, social media use, or like how people assess information sources, like all these things, and they would all be people in the same room at the same conference talking. So that was very fun. Also, that was a nice added bonus to to doing that work.
Yeah, this is kind of a weaving together of all of these. I mean, and to take this back to where we started, right? This
Mhm.
weaving together of all of these different interests and disciplines. And I think seeing that at these different scales, right? So here you are in
Yeah.
library sciences and kind of pulling these disparate threads and beginning to weave them together, but also within your interests in life and even
Hmm.
within a community on a bus where you're taking all these people that might not have much in common and weaving them together into a single space with
Hmm.
perhaps at least multiple destinations along a route and how that
Yeah.
begins to create something that is really textured. And I think that this happens within fermentation too, is it's
Hmm.
it's taking elements of place both in terms of microbes and food and our microbes and
Hmm.
historical context and the way that these ferments have been passed along in history and weaving together this idea of maybe it's a story and this has
Hmm.
come up a lot on the podcast lately is this idea of story and I really see you as a weaver of that in multiple different ways, right, of being able to
Hmm.
tease stories from people or help people see and express their own stories and of
Hmm.
telling the incredible stories of fermentation that you tell in our fermented lives and you yourself just kind of being this container for story.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I find it very interesting the way that, like, when I look at like, what this brings to mind for me is one of the big learnings from writing Our Fermented Lives was kind of this, both with fermentation and I think in general, this perception of ourselves that I developed where, yeah, I'm the bridge, and I say I, but we, like all of us are the bridge between like the past and the lessons of the past that we're carrying forward into the present and kind of examining and engaging with. and then deciding what we bring into the future. And so we have this opportunity to be, in a very real way, this bridge between like history and our role as ancestors. And like, what does that look like? And that, like, when I think about what you just said about story, I think like the stories we're weaving, whatever we're doing, I mean, do tie back into our role as ancestors in a very real way.
I love that. I was going to bring this in towards the end, but because we're here, I just want to,
We'll do it
be
now.
wherever we are. Yeah. Because I was actually really struck by the way, I mean, you have this sort of time traveling that you're doing in our fermented lives, but I think you're also doing an element of time travel within your work as a creative and a writing coach
Mhm.
in the way that you are creating containers for transformation. And I really see
Mhm.
fermentation as the transformation of one thing, but you're also sort of transforming by practice. But I was really struck by the ways that you think about the future, which has also been a theme on this podcast. And I pulled two quotes from you.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe I'd read them. And I think they just dovetail so beautifully into what is it that we want to create as
Mhm.
ancestors. Okay, so the first one is, as we look into the history of fermentation, we see not merely what people did, but also the dreams they had for transforming the world around them, feeding people when food wasn't otherwise to be had, adding new flavors, or altering their state of consciousness. Fermentation invites us to imagine a world of radical transformation, one based in possibility and potential. Then you talked about, and this is going to come up, I think, a lot in this podcast, the idea of a
Mhm.
container, whether that's a
Mhm.
creative container or just the vessel that we ferment in. And you said we shaped the vessels we needed to create the foods we wanted to make. And similarly, we have shaped the meaning around those foods within our lives and our communities. When we build what we need, we are able to re envision food systems that work for all of us, recognizing what is needed, such as familiar comfort foods, and what isn't, for example, exploitative farm labor practices. What will the future we build look like? And I think this is so beautiful because I think that we are at this moment where the stories that we tell ourselves become the bedrock of what is going forward. And that is also how we collect resources and information from history, both in terms of food and oral traditions and written word.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it offers us a couple opportunities, and one is expanding the stories we're looking at, which is something else I talk about a lot in the book of, whose stories get to be told and whose
Yes.
get to be recorded and whose don't. Um, but I think in kind of having this envisioning, and I'm glad you brought up like the stuff about containers, because when we think of like ourselves as containers, what do we contain? What are we creating? Like kind of
Mm,
this active engagement with like the self as both a site for creation and holding.
mm,
Um, I think it gets to something that I think a lot about with fermentation. And that, like, I'm not sure all of my readers necessarily, like, fully come along on this journey with me, and that's fine, they don't have to, but I very much am like, "No, this is, like, actually a really useful tool for, like, manifesting and for thinking about, like, intentions and bringing those to life." And, through this physical act and, like, setting an intention, working with this transformative, um, food making process, in doing that, it's like I am able to kind of infuse this feeling of this manifestation also happening, this transformation also happening into kind of the practice of watching that food transform. And I think even just thinking about the metaphor of that transformation and what that looks like is a useful way to remind us that like this isn't just like Julia kind of being like out there. Like this is actually a real thing. Like we really do have the power to transform our world in whatever ways that we see fit.
mhm. And I think that there's something about a tactile process of being able to witness a transformation in a micro world, where I think it becomes easier to imagine what sort of transformative processes can take place within our communities, both on a
Mhm.
local scale and at a bigger scale, and to kind of feel and witness that firsthand in a container at home.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and again, kind of thinking about the foods themselves as being this site for that community connection too. Like I love learning from other people about the ways that like kimchi is a good example. Everybody has their own kimchi recipe, right? Like, and so every time I learn that, it's like we have this vessel that kind of
Mm,
both serves as metaphor, but again, actual site for that connection because we're talking about the ways that we've made this food. And I'm going to make it differently than you. And, but we're both bringing that to the table and that becomes a part of this vessel.
mm. And we become a part of that vessel, and the members, all the
Mhm.
hands that have touched that food, all the
Mhm.
environments that food has been in are picking up microbes from that place, from those
Mhm.
people that are eventually becoming a part of that ferment. And I think you talk about in Korean, there's a term, sun mat,
Mhm.
and that is very much about that sort of taste of person that is going
Mhm.
into this, all the hands along the way, that this truly is a physical manifestation of a
Mhm.
community of people and a community of microbes.
Yeah. Yeah. It was something that was very kind of, I think, and I'm sure you've had this experience when you're engaged in a creative project and you kind of have like a little bit of a feeling of like, oh, I think this is something that I might kind of dig into or discover as I'm doing this. And then it surprises you the way that that happens. Like, I was like, I'm going to think about community, but then, yeah, like this idea of like community existing, like community extant in a single ingredient or in a single
Mm,
dish beyond like with the microbial community, but like the ingredient also being the sum of that food's history, all the people who touched it like as they were growing it and getting it to the market and whatever, like there being so much story just in like that cabbage before you ever even make it into sauerkraut was like such a cool learning or kind of reaffirmation of this work.
You did such a beautiful job of that too, of even exploring how fermentation influenced the plant species that we chose to interact with and domesticate, these deep histories that go through human history and different cultural histories. And I I I thought that was, I mean, that touched my version of passionate nerdiness, um, whatever you want to call it. But just how rich that is. And I think that in understanding that, and I want to bring it back to this word that you use because it's so beautiful, understanding that brings us to the space where we are in this moment, that bridge to and a part of
Hmm.
that ever growing history.
Yeah. Yeah, which I hope, like, I don't know, I hope is one of the main takeaways that people would take from this book and maybe from my work in general is like, whatever it is you're doing, like, you are shaping history and you're shaping the world with your choices. Like, it's not like only famous people or whatever are the only people who do that. Like, each of us every day is creating history.
Mhm.
Yeah, however that looks.
You do a really, I think you do a really beautiful job of imbuing your work with that sense of agency, and the idea that to use your voice to put your creative work into the world, or even to create it for yourself, for your
Mhm.
internal world, is this act of transformation. And I think with that, I want to come back to the way that you create container. We've talked a little bit about
Mhm.
container in terms of fermentation a little bit, but I really think that what you are doing that I haven't really seen anyone else do is creating a beautiful container to culture and
Mhm.
cultivate creative practice in individuals, maybe specifically writing, but I think that it applies in a sort of global sense to creative practice, and to give it, and some of these are words directly from you, to give it some boundaries and to give it a sense of play and a sense of joy and a sense of rest at times. And since we're right here at the beginning of the year, to give it a sense of goals that are very much a part of process and divorced from sort of the goals of hustle culture or the productivity driven capitalism we experience so much.
Yeah. And especially apply to our creative practices in ways that like sap all the life out of them or can.
Yes.
But
And
like,
I was really struck by that as I kind of crafted some of my own goals for this year.
oh, good. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel so seen with having you say that because that is like such an important part of my work is this like giving people a sense of agency, like especially, I mean, whether they're writers, but also like in my cooking classes and in whatever, like there's just I feel like we are so often told the reasons why we shouldn't have agency. Like we're
Mm.
so often told, you're not writing enough, your writing's not good enough. Or like that thing you want to make is like too big, too scary, too something. And so it's either we're either at the end of like some spectrum where either it's not good enough or it's like too much. And like we feel like we don't feel like we're ever in a place where we can create. Or I say we as kind of a general statement, but like
Call it the royal we.
the royal we. Yes.
The royal we.
All of us creatives, so everybody, because we're all creative in our own way, experiences this. But yeah, like giving people that space to really, again, like you said, like create and have that container, like, and to recognize that the container we're shaping for each person is different. Like, whether that's in our ferments or whether that's like in my writing coaching, for example, like I have kind of a like flow of like, here's the things that we cover during, these meetings in this like 2-month coaching, program or whatever. But like I keep that very, very high level because people are going to need very different things. Each container we build, the whole point is to make a container that works specifically for you, that's like actually holds what matters to you. And, that may be a very differently shaped container than, than the one that works for me.
Mm-hmm. I love this, and I think you speak really really beautifully to this actually in the book talking about containers for ferments, but I think it applies to writing. And you said in the process they added meaning to the words by literally shaping into existence the tools they needed to create foods that would keep them fed far into the future. And I actually put this in my creative practice and craft section for you
Oh.
because I think that you have this idea of that there is infinite diversity within creative practice, and each individual is going to need different containers that are going to hold them in the ways that they need to be held to
Mhm.
create a process and a practice that works for their unique needs and their unique creative expression.
Yeah, very much so. And I like that you connected like the active shaping of the container to that because it is, I mean, like we have so much agency to make that container look however we want. It's something that I think, especially coming from academia and anybody who's worked with academics, I think is very aware of this, like some of the more toxic parts of that space where a lot of the principles that we apply from this sort of like grind culture, like writing's supposed to be a slog. Why aren't you writing? But like writing's supposed to be terrible and hard and like never fun because if it's fun, then your research isn't serious. um, and so like deprogramming all of that from myself and then like reprogramming in like you can't. I'm not sure. how much you can really see my studio space, but I have like back here, I have like this little cozy, I've got boxes in front of it right now, but just pretend you can see it. But this like comfy space where like I have like, cushions on the floor and like nice like leather bound notebooks and like
Mm,
nice little lights. And I just like lay on these cushions and like write stuff out. And that's how I start my writing practice most mornings is like I sit in my little sort of like meditative writing corner and just like am just like whatever I need, like whatever needs to come out, like, if I have a specific thing I want to focus on, maybe I will, but like we're just gonna kind of start the day with this brain dump and like give myself permission to realize that the ideas that like kind of just like come in your brain and maybe aren't fully formed yet, like that they have just as much of a right to exist in the world and they're going kind of tying back to what we talked about, like they're going to eventually kind of weave themselves in
yeah.
somewhere.
I was thinking about that. And I think that you're speaking to something, and that little quote speaks to something too, is that when we're kind of, I don't know, deprogramming ourselves in whatever way from grind culture or from the sort of
Mhm.
linear productivity that we learn in society, it also becomes about being nourished. And I think that
Mhm.
one of those things that steals, one of the things that grind culture, that sort of capitalist work ethic, Calvinism steals away from us,
Mhm.
is the idea that this is something to nourish and feed us, that it is and can be
Yeah.
a connection to joy and also to something that is playful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, part of like it's so empowering to reclaim that, like, kind of building on what you're saying is like when we have that taken away, it's like, oh, well, like the thing that's supposed to bring me joy is like just as much of a slog as like, working in this exploitative job. And so I'll just like work and like do that. Like it makes it easier for us to then just kind of, yeah, just be stuck in that grind culture, and not even seek pleasure from what we're, supposed to find pleasure from. And that, yeah, I have many opinions about all of
I
that.
mean, share whatever you want. This is
Yeah.
a space for opinions. It's a space for whatever you want to share. So and we can always edit things out later. I didn't
Yeah,
say that at the front, but that is the
a
case.
thing we can do.
That is a
Yeah.
thing that we can do. Um, yeah, because I love this, and I loved. It's hard to deprogram, and I think that actually some of that programming, another little piece of this that I had explored is you don't really believe in failure, and I think that it is
Mhm.
that linear hustle culture that kind of teaches us about those first inklings of failure. And you wrote at one
Yeah.
point, in regards to failure, I have a couple of little quotes here. But you wrote, for me, the combo of academia with a few other life things, which were
Uh-huh.
capitalized and I loved, meant that writing felt like a field of landmines for most of my life. Any tiny misstep, whether a sloppy sentence or incomplete thought, could blow up the whole project or maybe my whole career. And you
Mhm.
go on to talk about this in the way that you no longer and or don't believe in failure. And I loved this because as a maybe a recovering perfectionist, which again I think
Yeah.
is something that we get out of grind culture. You do, like, you hit this
Mhm.
little tiny road bump and you just you let it deflate all the tires on your
Yeah.
car and let you crash into a tree, and like, well, if I can't do it in this way, then maybe I just won't do it at
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
and it's
Yep.
really antithetical to that creative practice.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think like kind of going back to like fermentation and I talk a lot about like fermentation as a teacher, right? Like in ways we never expect. Like I never really expected like fermentation to like be like, oh, this is how I like became a better writing coach was by making
Mm,
ferments every day. But I mean, what fermentation teaches, or one of the things it teaches you is to relinquish control. Like I I am collaborating. Like at every moment, I'm collaborating with my ideas as a writer. I'm collaborating with microbes in my kitchen. I'm like, it's why I find like the focus on community so critical because we are absolutely deluding ourselves if we think every moment of our existence isn't a collaboration. Um,
Yes.
and I think that's kind of having that knowledge really sink in and become central has been so transformative to how I view success and failure. Because, like, if I'm collaborating, like, if I'm like, "Oh, this project, like, was a failure," rather than like, "Oh, this didn't work, and, like, now we know better for next time." Like, if I say it's a failure, like, me and all the ideas and all of the microbes and everybody I'm collaborating with, like, they've all failed too, and I don't want them to feel
Oh,
like that. Like I want us
wow.
all to, you know, feel
Mm.
good and feel supported and nourished, so
Oh,
that's,
that's really beautiful. I don't think it's so funny. I think about this with my body sometimes, right? I have this joke, and we've talked
Mhm.
about this on this podcast, that sometimes I think of myself as just a really fun tour bus for all the microbes in my
Yeah.
body, right? And so I am just the vehicle in which they are
Yeah.
experiencing different parts of the world that maybe they never anticipated experiencing. And I think that when I am able to sort of transcend out of that idea as self as one into self as
Mhm.
many, just within a single container, it also helps me
Mhm.
extrapolate too that I am self in my community, and that there is this constant reciprocity and flow between those places. But I don't think I've
Yeah.
ever couched it in terms of failure too, and that and the desire, I think, within ourselves, where we treat ourselves harsher than we would ever treat another.
Mhm.
We would never, that self-talk, we would never do that
Yeah.
for a loved one, or maybe even for a microbe that we're collaborating with.
Yeah. Yeah. I love my microbes. I want them to be happy.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I feel that way about it's helped my relationship with my body too. So I've done like a lot of somatic work this year, a lot of like nervous system
Mhm.
work. Like many of us, I have like, many traumas to unpack and many,
You and me both.
and the yeah. And so like the way that our bodies store those is very interesting. And like it's been a very revealing an interesting year to kind of dive into what that looks like for my body. But then in keeping with that, like viewing my nervous system as like this friend who's like trying to protect me and who like maybe like created these particular places they held this or whatever in an attempt to protect me, like the way that like I view my body has changed very much because like now my body is a collaborator rather than I think the way we often view our bodies. And I like that like you brought in like this fun tour bus kind of imagery of like our body as like this like actually very cool site for like, for being and community and expression. And like yeah, like, I'm so much gentler on my body now because, like, I view my body as my friend rather than like, "Oh, I have some ache or pain, it's because, like, my body has failed." It's like, "No, like, my body isn't failing. Like, it's
Mm,
fine." Like, we're collaborating and we can, like, nourish each other and work with each other through kind of whatever we encounter.
mm. I love that. And I think, as somebody, I've struggled a lot with chronic illness, and I've been very, very sick in my life. I'm lucky to not be nearly as sick as I was.
Mhm.
But I noticed that a lot of our language around how we interact in our relationship with our body is
Mhm.
one of war and of
Yeah.
fight, and this really makes a difference when you're able to see your body as a collaborator. And even some of these, whether they are illnesses that your body has developed or
Mhm.
protective mechanisms that your nervous system has instated. I know, and I'll just speak for myself here, but I I worked a lot with hypervigilance this
Mm.
last year,
Mhm.
and hypervigilance and the way that it shuts down certain aspects of my body and puts me into a more frozen space can be really
Yeah.
frustrating. And I can view it as, as you said, as this aspect of failure. But when I
Mhm.
relook through the lens of the ways in which my body has been trying to work with me in that way to protect me,
Mhm.
and to bring me into a safer space throughout my life, then it becomes this collaboration of how can we, and I often speak to myself using, I say we in my head when I'm,
Mhm.
and I mean me and my mind and my body and my microbes and the
Yeah.
we that I am, or I'm just speaking like Gollum to myself as an alternative. Um, but that softer viewpoint allows, again, for exactly what you said, which is a sense of collaboration moving forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and kind of, going to this thinking of grind culture, I see so much of a mirror between that language and the way we describe
Mm.
our bodies and our sense of, productivity even in our hobbies and, very much this like, like getting it done, like, whatever success thing, whatever challenge thing. Like I'm so into like everybody exercising like in the ways that work for our bodies. Like, yes, let's do that. But like I get really frustrated with, something like, let's say, I don't know, the 45-day CrossFit challenge or something, like the language around that, because it's like, yes, I want to challenge my body, but when like challenge is given this like kind of negative language that implies failure from the start, like
Mm.
implies that if I like were to miss a day of that, that I've somehow completely
Yes.
derailed it.
Yes.
Like it makes it so now if there's anything that's like a whatever fitness challenge, like I don't even do it. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't because I'm going to miss a day because I'm a person and I have
Yes.
like,
Needs.
and yeah, needs and like maybe I get tired or maybe I'm sick or maybe
Yes.
I'm, on a plane all day and like can't get up and do my, my exercise. Like and yeah, like that's sort of again kind of coming back to that like language and like some of the things that I think we have kind of ported over from these various toxic cultures into things like our hobbies and our joy. Um, yeah,
Yes.
it
Yes.
applies everywhere.
Absolutely. It absolutely applies everywhere. And I think it applies, especially maybe even at this time of year when we see so
Mm,
much around challenges and goal setting.
yeah,
And, I told you at the outset of
yeah.
this that you had really influenced my idea of goal setting as I transitioned into this year. I just recorded a little solo episode about goal setting. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I have a quote from you here and a couple of thoughts. Um, been thinking a lot about not goal as output, right? This idea of
Hmm.
who will be at the end, but as goal as process. And I think you speak so
Hmm.
beautifully to process on all of these different levels. I mean, I have this whole section here that's process, but I pulled in this quote from a chef, and there are a couple of words I'm going to pick on, but I loved the spirit of it, which is the way I choose to
Hmm.
function is to pick an arbitrary, stupid goal, become totally involved in it, and pursue it with vigor. And what happens to you in that pursuit is your life. And what I loved about this, because I don't, our goals don't need to be stupid or arbitrary but that
Hmm.
process is, I think, the goal. It's our
Hmm.
relationship to the process of unfurling, the process of transformation that happens in the space of right now where we are, and that bridge into maybe not even a singular point in the future, but
Hmm.
something else. And you had a beautiful little bit about goals on your Substack. And I wrote this down because I was thinking about how we get outside of the idea of goals from grind
Hmm.
culture. And you said the purpose of goal setting is not to force ourselves to do more faster, but rather to foster the momentum that we already have. Goals are there to support consistent progress towards completing your book or house painting or whatever, and to provide you with evidence of that progress. A good goal is one you can reach. A good goal probably stretches you a little, maybe pushes you outside your comfort zone, and asks for you to consistently show up for your work. The best goals for me may not be the best goals for you, which is why I spend so much time with folks figuring out how goals work best for them. And I'll just tell you briefly and then I'll let you talk because I've
Yeah.
gone on for way too long. So I sat yesterday, I found this really big tree on my hike and I sat with it and I just wondered if trees have goals, right? And if they did, what that would look like. And I thought
Hmm.
about they definitely have, I think, a biological drive to receive a lot of sunlight and nourishment. And, whether that biological drive is a goal or whether or not a tree and an ecosystem and a forest has more complicated processes than I could ever imagine,
Hmm.
which I think is definitely true. I thought about this, that this is about, first of all, that it's about, having a sense of community and that
Hmm.
it's about process. It's about the bridge and it's about what happens in between and less about
Hmm.
that output.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned this because I was thinking actually earlier today about, because like one of the blessings and curses of like actually owning a writing coaching business is like, part of the blessing is like I get to tell people everything that's exciting about this and I get to like work with these clients and do all these amazing things. And then one of the things I personally struggle with is like the marketing side. Like I'm not like naturally a marketer.
Me neither.
Like it's a skill I'm learning. But so I was thinking about the marketing earlier today, and something that came to mind was how I've been really resistant to like talking about goals right now, like this time of year in my marketing language for the
Mhm.
reasons like, that you just shared so well of like what goals can be and the ways that goals can support us versus the primary narrative we're having about goals at the beginning of the year and like the clients and the kind of work I want to attract. I'm not going to be a good fit for somebody who wants, like really strict, like, 45-day challenge sort of goals. Like that's they will not like working with me and I will probably also find it very frustrating. And
Yes. Yes. You're just not a good fit.
yeah. Um and yeah, so I was like because I love talking about the potential of goals and the way that, you described, like the way that like goals are processed and goals are never if we don't meet them, it's never a failure. It's simply an opportunity to like be more informed about my unique writing. How do I create? Like if I didn't meet my goal, I'm like, okay, what I've learned is like when like that this isn't compatible with whatever kind of aspect of my process or life right now. Um yeah, and it's such a radical shift in how we think about goal setting. And yeah, I think is very counter to how we're talking about it right now. And so,
Yes. Because
yeah.
I think goals are they can reveal to us that process, and in terms of failure, you talked about, and I loved this, and I'm going to tie this back to your work on process, but this is a quote. As so often happens in life, the worry was worse than the failure. I realized, so what if I do fail? I've definitely made plenty of mistakes in fermenting, as has every other fermenter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All fermentation asks of you that you show up with an open heart, creative mind, and hands ready to work. If you do, it will reward you either with a lesson or with something delicious, possibly something delicious beyond what you ever imagined. But I think that this is true of our creative process and goals too. And
Mhm.
something that you equated was learning your process, which I think we're going to learn through maybe not always meeting all of our expectations or something not
Mhm.
lining up the way that we thought it might, is that you are learning how to find joy in it. And I love that
Yeah.
you said that because, again, it tied it back to like knowing and learning your process allows you to access more joy around it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as one of those, when we think about the unexpected lessons of fermentation, like fermentation is kind of this inherently like not capitalist, like very democratic, very like serendipitous and surprising way of engaging with the world. Like when I ferment food, I mean, one, there's Sander Katz has talked about this before about like this inherent democracy in fermentation because like nobody can ever round up all the wild microbes and then charge you for them, right? Like it's not physically possible. So like, which I love. And I think starting from that point, when we then think about fermentation being something that teaches us like, yeah, the power of process and the power of stepping outside of that sort of capitalist mindset of creation and failure and like that like hands ready to work and hands ready to create and a creative heart can be enough. Beautiful things can happen from that. I don't have to be creating on behalf of like some larger system. Like I can just make some sauerkraut and that is also useful. Like I like that it imagines a world where our large and small creations are kind of given like all given their due weight
Mm,
in our lives.
mm. I love that. It imagines a world where our large and small creations are given a due weight in our lives. Yes. Yes. And I think that this is really big because think within the imagining of creative pursuits, whether that's a ferment or a piece of writing or a piece of woodwork or a piece of art, it can sometimes we can get caught in exactly what you said earlier, that it's not enough or that it's too big.
Hmm.
And that they both have these beautiful spaces and weights and
Yeah, and just ways of finding kind of recognizing that like that scale need not apply or like maybe applies differently to each of us, but like within that you have the space to find what your like big scary exciting thing is and like focus your attention there. And I think with fermentation it gives us a way to do that feels accessible and feels like something we can engage with in community but also in private, and
mm,
prepares us then to be able to do that more broadly, to be able to
mm,
say, I have done this work with my community. I have done the big scary thing. I don't know. For me, it was working with koji for the first time. And like, I was so scared of making koji. And then, but I did it. And I was like, my community and I have done this. And it really was very affirming and reminding to me of like, I have overcome this thing that felt big and scary. I
mm.
now am more prepared to do this, in other parts of my life.
Oh, this is, I think this is the beauty of having, you talk about both process and practice, right? And
Hmm.
I think that when we have these various practices, this practice of fermentation that allows us to access this, and you talk about this beautifully in the book. I have a couple of quotes, these sort of rituals or sort of meditative practices that we begin to take some of those lessons and apply them elsewhere. I know that my
Hmm.
walking practice has done this for me a lot and feels very
Hmm.
accessible to me, this act of walking most days,
Yeah.
and it has trickled into other little pieces of my life where I've begun to learn something. And I think, again, something that you do well is not just speaking to practice but also taking these bites that feel just the right size
Hmm.
to help us take bites out of bigger things. And I wrote this
Hmm.
down as your story about painting just one wall,
Yeah.
which I thought was so perfect for those of us that sometimes feel that our we don't know how to break down our big dreams into a piece that is
Yeah.
manageable initially.
Yeah. That was such helpful advice. My friend Ellen shared that with me because I was like, oh, I have to paint the inside of my house and I'm so stressed and everything's stressful and it's all terrible. And
I've never said anything
like,
like that sentence.
never. Yeah,
Just every day.
never.
Just every day. Mhm.
um and so she was like, well, why don't you just do it one wall at a time? Like, why are you freaking yourself out? And I was like, oh, right. Okay. And it made so much sense, and it made me laugh because it's like the exact kind of advice that like I give to my writing coaching clients. Like they come to me and they're like, I have to write this book and it's so big and it's so, and I don't know what to do. And I'm like, okay, well, let's start breaking it down into like smaller pieces and then break those pieces down and go from there. And they're like, oh, right, okay. Like, it was interesting to have the experience kind of on the other side of that, with that quote. But yeah, I think that's like, that speaks again, like I love that you're focusing on like both the process and like the process supporting the product sort of part of this, because like, yeah, like if you're not enjoying the process, then like what is the point? Like if writing my entire book is a slog and I hate it, my book's not going to be very good, right?
No.
Like nobody's going to want to read that book.
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
like I'll have gotten done with it and I won't want to celebrate it because it sucked to write, and I'll just be like, oh, like I accomplished this thing, but who even cares? Um yeah, like it's not the vibe we wanna cultivate.
Yeah, as I thought about this in terms of whether it was goal setting or anything else, the process is almost our relationship in multi in different levels to the thing itself. So the process is our relationship to the act of writing, but it's also our relationship to ourselves in the
Hmm.
act of writing, and to our relationship with others that we interact with, that feed into that, or that we share space with, or that we share
Hmm.
community with. And so that process is really the unfolding of relationship within this thing. And
Hmm.
the practice is, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit better, because I was trying to tease out the two as I put these notes together. And the practice
Hmm.
is this sort of ritual, this container that we
Hmm.
create, that we can come back to, and that
Yeah.
is holding and creating a good space for process to cultivate, or to culture,
Yeah.
or to ferment.
Yeah. 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 No, I like kind of going back to this container metaphor because it is so, so in keeping with how I work. And yeah, I first started to think about the writing process in that way so in addition to doing my own writing coaching, I also work with scholars and writers, which is like specifically an academic coaching.
Mm.
And in that space, we started to talk about, or one of the things we do talk about is a writing ritual. Um, which I've sensed like is one of the parts of that process that I have really like latched onto and have like really emphasized in my own work, of like kind of creating this sacred container around your writing, letting your writing be important enough to have joyful things connected to it
Mm.
and surrounding it, and like separating it from the rest of life. Um And it's also why I dig so much into celebration too, because we tend to not celebrate ourselves, our writing, or in general. We tend to not be very good at that.
Yes.
Um, and so it's something that I really try to encourage people, like when I work with other writers, or when I'm kind of in whatever context, if I'm teaching a cooking class or whatever, and like somebody does a thing that's very cool, I'm just like, I want them to know that that thing is cool. I'm excited for them, and I want,
Mm.
what I hope is everybody listening to this like finds ways to really genuinely celebrate themselves, and to like to connect into that energy of celebration, because when you're coming from that place of like this is something I enjoy doing, this is sacred time in my life, whether I'm making a ferment or writing a book or doing whatever else, and I'm going to celebrate myself for having devoted my energy to the thing I love,
Mm.
like then it becomes so much easier and more pleasurable, like that just continues to build.
Mm.
And not only that, but then you have more to celebrate. Like when I come from my writing from a place of like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like I'm doing this thing. This is great. Um, the writing flows better, and I meet my goals more easily also. So it benefits us. I think we have, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but this like, oh, I can't like have fun or slow down or whatever. I've got too much to do sort of mindset, right? And it's like we tend to think that like slowing down and really tapping into like the pleasure of our work is like very frivolous. Like again, one of those like toxic capitalist things we've been taught is that like if you're enjoying yourself, you're definitely doing something wrong. Which
Absolutely.
like, of course, somebody who wants to like pay you less than you're worth and keep you stuck in like a rat race job is going to say that to you, because if you figure out the truth, then you're not going to want to do that anymore. Um, but we internalize that, and so then when it's like, oh, like I'm writing and it's kind of feeling like a slog, instead of like getting up and like having some fun and coming back to it from this better headspace or celebrating what you've already done or whatever, yeah, we just assume that like, oh, well, I just have to keep slogging through this. And yeah, that is a very long-winded way of saying people should celebrate themselves more.
No, I love this because this dovetails into like this idea of they're almost feedback loops of joy and of pleasure and of also too incorporating like a slower idea of this, of taking productivity out of it and putting rest and joy and
Mhm.
pleasure back into something that I think that it has really shifted, because I find myself constantly caught in slogging through something because it's become yet another thing on this endless to-do list, and I feel absolutely overwhelmed. And so this thing that
Mhm.
once brought me joy and that I'm now and I think this is another propensity that you speak really well to, that as creatives, we're often monetizing those things that give us joy, which then connects us back into a system
Mhm.
that feels really hard to be joyful in. And so the
Yeah.
more that we can create celebration and pleasure and joy, I think it builds on itself and a sense of play. And not to
Yeah.
not to bring in a sort of biological aspect, but play is when we are most plastic, when
Mhm.
our neurochemistry is at its most flexible and plastic and childlike. And I think
Mhm.
that joy is also accessing some of that playfulness within our work that I wouldn't want to lose, but I lose all the time, if I'm being honest.
I mean, we all do. I mean, it's such a process, right, of unlearning and relearning
Mm.
all of this. Yeah, but I think it's interesting how much we've like, I want to say demonized play, but have like frivolized, if that's a word. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's a word.
actually, I think that's a perfect it doesn't matter, it's a perfect word, frivolized.
Yeah, it's made it, yeah, I mean, so that this like at this time when we're like most powerfully able to receive, whether that's new ideas or
Mm.
whatever, we like the systems in which we live have cut us off from that and have convinced us that there's no other way to live.
Yeah.
Like, we're in such a lack mindset now
Yes.
about, well, if I don't play into these particular systems, I will never experience abundance. I will always be financially insecure, or I will never have my work published, or I will, whatever it is, right? Um, and in so doing, because those systems say there's no other way, I mean, we believe that because we're told that our whole
Our
lives.
whole lives.
And the amount of deprogramming you have to do, like, I feel so much more secure now that I am not in a 9 to 5 job, like in every way, right? But I always thought, like, if you don't have a 9 to 5 job, like, how will you ever like pay your bills or, whatever else? And it's, like, not that this is like a financial conversation, but it's kind of part of that larger
Mm.
conversation of like bringing in things to us, whatever those things are, and that sense of play being an important way of doing that. Because, like, when I play, I'm able to, like, really tap into the things that matter most to me and how I want to share them and how they might actually be helpful to people. Like, like I want to help people. And what's the best way to do that is by letting kind of my heart and my intuition and my playful spirit lead me in that process.
Hmm. I think that comes through too. It comes through in the you create something of an invitation both to oneself and into to working with you that is inherently a little bit playful, and in the best possible way. And I think that play as an antidote to this sort of lack mindset is very interesting, because play, when you are in that space, it is infinite possibilities, right? It is abundance
Mhm.
in terms of being infinite possibilities. And I think a lot about the aspect of deprogramming ourselves from some of these messages and stories that we have inherited from mother culture.
Mhm.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are too, because I think that some of the first bits of deprogramming are just recognizing that there's programming there.
Yeah.
and
Yeah, absolutely.
and then and then there is this process of dismantling it and finding those things that are curative in a way,
Yeah.
something like play or joy,
Mhm.
or accessing this different relationship to process.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why, that like celebration aspect of my work is so powerful when I'm working with clients because like especially when I'm working with folks who are very much in these structures who maybe, are working in a corporate environment or in academia and are very like beholden in many ways to these
Mm,
structures. And it does, I mean, like, yes, it starts with us kind of recognizing, like having that little spark of possibility, however that comes to us. And then from there, giving ourselves that permission to like let it lead us in some way. And I think giving ourselves permission to celebrate ourselves
mm,
in whatever, like having taken, 5 minutes to play around in the kitchen this morning rather than just immediately sitting down and working,
mm,
or having written 100 words, or having, whatever you do, like whatever the thing is, um, provides the opportunity for that spark
mm,
to come to you because you're giving yourself an alternative. Like you are building the alternative in so that it can then kind of grow and become more present. Um,
mm,
Yeah, yeah, but it is, I mean, kind of thinking about the process holistically, and you were talking about like you kind of have this initial moment and then like figure out how to dismantle. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I don't know like if you've talked about this with other guests, but like the very different ways that that manifests in each of our lives.
mm,
So for me, there's a lot of hyper specific things that also I think connect to our larger kind of cultural programming. So like I was raised in a church that's like very evangelical, is like commonly listed in various, sites, online sites that cover these things as a cult. Like it was a pretty intense childhood, right?
yeah.
But and so that comes with some of its own special programming. But connected with like larger cultural programming around women in society and around morality and share expressing yourself and whatever else. And as a queer person, it provided some many other fun layers that I've spent many thousands of dollars in therapy unpacking as well. And like, but we all have that programming, and so it's I mention that because each of us kind of comes to the table with like the different ways that that programming was instilled, and so, yeah, it's interesting once you start to go down that rabbit hole, like, the things that emerge that I think you never would've, like, thought about necessarily, like, for me, I didn't realize how much that church was, like, really responsible for a lot of that programming, but now that I know that, it's so much easier to unpack it.
Mhm. Yes. I think it is that initial naming of the thing.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
of these things that we can't necessarily initially see, right? These sort of structures, this scaffolding, or for our thought processes that have been
Mhm.
built from the ground up, from childhood up, within our homes,
Yeah.
within our communities, within our religious institutions, within our societal institutions, and all of those having this. And I've been thinking a lot about this, having a deeper history too within these
Mhm.
historical narratives and the stories we tell
Yeah.
and the stories we don't tell, and have not looked at as shaping who we are. And I think as we've talked about this, I think that again, this is something that happens in small bites usually, and
Mhm.
not just some big wrecking ball that comes through,
Yeah.
but it is maybe not the painting of a wall, but a taking down of one
Mhm.
wall, of one brick at a time.
Mhm.
And then having these practices and processes to hold us in that space, because it is not easy. It
Yeah.
is not easy work. And so I think when we're speaking to having a practice or a process that not only gives us joy, but, and I want to go back to something you said, but that gives us a spark to lead us into those things that we are curious and passionate about. That is a part
Yeah.
of building new structures. And I think that oftentimes those structures that we're talking about, that society, that Mother
Mhm.
Culture has built, that we've been inculcated in, they hide that spark away from us sometimes, where we
Mhm.
can't always feel that. Because that was something I was gonna ask you, like, how do you access that and cultivate the bravery or the
Mhm.
chutzpah or whatever it is to follow that thing?
But it's interesting because as you're saying that, like, I kind of had this, like, this mental picture of, like, the way in which when we talk about community, we often view these structures as kind of independent of community almost. Like, it's like, these are the structures around, that, like, are commonly accepted moral code or
Mhm.
whatever. Um, and we tend to view those as independent of us rather than, like, the structure itself being of community. And I
Mm.
wonder,
Mhm.
maybe if, like, kind of thinking about this bridge between past and future and thinking about the humanity of the structures is maybe an entry point to
Mm.
collectively finding that spark more, is like one thing we might be able to bring into the future is recognizing that, like, every single system and structure that exists around us was consciously or unconsciously built by the collective and can be, with intention, reimagined by the collective.
Mm.
And well, that's a very big goal and doesn't, like, if one individual
Mm.
person is like, "What can I do today?" That doesn't answer their question. But, like, but I think bearing that in mind when those structures do feel very heavy and feel particularly present, remembering that they are of people and of community, and
Oh.
perhaps we have the opportunity to reimagine what community we allow as a society. What structures have a place, what voices have a place, and maybe more voices can have a place, and that would be cool. Um,
Mm.
I mean, as far as people specifically finding that spark, I really think that focusing on celebration is a great way to start, like, focusing on what's already working and what joy you're already seeing, like, and just giving yourself permission to, like, feel that in your body. Like, let that really resonate in you. Um, and, like, give yourself permission to even just, like, a couple minutes a day, like 5 minutes a day, do something you love. Like, those 2 things can really be a huge reset and really helpful.
I want to touch on both things that you talked about, but you really unlocked something for me just then. I think those structures that have been created loom for me in a way that is superhuman, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem created by humans, by communities of the past, of the present. They seem somehow outside of that, and I think that that makes
Mm-hmm.
them seem incredibly inaccessible for changing, for reimagining.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we reimagine? I feel like there's a way to begin to tell new stories, to begin to
Mm-hmm.
reimagine something, and it feels so big. I have to come back to Mark Fisher attributes it to somebody else, but he says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. um,
Yeah.
and within that, I'm also reading a lot of David Graeber right now, who talks a lot about imagination, and been thinking a lot about how do we reimagine, but I hadn't thought those were built by humans, and here we are,
Mm-hmm.
humans in community. We can rebuild those things, and that really reframes something from something that feels insurmountable into something that
Mm-hmm.
feels very, very doable and accessible. And so I want to thank you for that gift of those are
Yeah.
human structures too.
Yeah. It reminds me of there's this, and it pops up on social media a lot. This quote from, I think it's Ursula K. Le Guin, who's a
The
wonderful
best.
author.
I mean, the
Yeah.
best. This is the best.
um, who, and I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember the exact quote, but basically it's like, we don't think capitalism is like able to be overcome, but like people used to believe that the divine right of kings was immutable, and that's no longer true. Like,
Yeah.
she says it way better than I just did, but like, but that idea, right, of like, there are historic examples of these structures no longer existing, um, and being reimagined. And other examples of ways they've shifted in like less healthy and useful ways. But like, yeah, like we have precedent for reimagining and reshaping and like deciding what like community scale and community like means to us.
Is a huge, I think that is a huge part of that, and something that is, and again, and now I want to touch on, the idea of nurturing the spark through celebration and through
Mhm.
accessing joy, even if it's just 5 minutes a day of doing something that you love. I actually think is a big part of what it means to reimagine. And
Mhm.
I know that for me, actually, food has been one of the easiest places to spend that 5 minutes, because I have to feed myself every day.
Right.
and
Yeah.
and so there's this kind of built-in opportunity to have joy through the tending to my food and nourishment, whether that's fermentation, which, as I was reading your book, I was like, I don't really do a lot. I've done some, but I've made some
Mhm.
vinegars and stuff. I was like, I don't do a lot, but I ferment all of my own animal feed, and
Uh-huh.
I also make yogurt all the time, and so that has changed my relationship to those two
Yeah.
things, as this sort of tending to myself, to a community, and
Mhm.
an access point for joy and now celebration.
Yeah. But I think that's especially beautiful with like animal feed too. I no longer have birds, but I used to keep chickens and quail, and like, yeah, fermenting their food, like kind of adds this layer of like of care and community, into that in a very cool way.
It
Um
it
and
really
there's like
does it. Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's like, as you were talking, it kind of brought up this other thing that like my dad and I talk about a lot, of like this like moving towards what you want rather than like getting fixated on what you don't. Like,
Mm.
letting your fixation and your focus be in the place where you want things to go. Um like, so I am a person with incredible crippling anxiety. I'm like anxious all the time and like constantly worry about everything. Like, which when I tell people this, and I feel like you and I probably have a similar experience with this because I think we're both very good at publicly positioning ourselves as being like, look, everything's great.
Yeah.
But like in in the quiet, reaches of my mind is like every, all kinds of stuff's knocking around in there about how everything's terrifying and whatever. And so this is like, for me, this is like almost a survival mechanism because otherwise I would like go absolutely nuts. Like I would just be like, I don't know, laying in a ball on the floor. But it also gives me a very valuable tool to like that reimagining on the micro scale of myself affords me then an easier access point to reimagining on a larger scale. So I'm able to say, okay, like rather than what I don't want, which is whatever the hell thing I'm worrying about right now, which
Hyper
changes
fixating
every
on
5 minutes.
for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, same. Like, and I do the same thing where I'm just like, oh, I had this ache in my arm. Does that mean I have a, end of the world health thing? I don't. I'm fine. Like, I know, but like, or whatever. Whatever thing it might be. But like then fixating on, the thing I want, being like, no, like I know that I'm healthy. I do good things for my body. Like, and then fixating on like being like, no, I'm healthy and letting myself kind of turn my thoughts repeatedly towards that. In doing that, and like letting the hyperfixation, like giving a counter narrative to it, I tend to do the thing on like the macro scale too, like the same thing where I tend to hyperfixate on like how terrifying and, disconcerting and, defeating many things feel. And so having this tool at the micro level of refocusing really has helped on the macro scale too. Like even if I don't have solutions, like I wish I did, but like at least being able to reimagine what it could look like in the first place, like at least makes them possible, maybe.
Yes. I really like this. My hyper fixation always, I say that it takes the form like my worry, my anxiety, this constantly gnawing beast. Often takes, I'm waiting for another shoe to drop, and I imagine all these different shoes that might be, right? And this is old. This is from childhood and the house that I grew up in, and this expectation that dread is just around the next corner. And it is hard to reframe that in those moments of something else that might be around the next corner, or even just what is here that I know of right now, right? Like might not know what's going to happen in 5 minutes or tomorrow or next week or next year, but I know that right here right now I have these things that I can ground into. And I think that you said something that kind of tripped something for me, which is you don't have the solutions. And I think that oftentimes none of us really have the solutions on a micro or a macro scale, right? Like we don't have the solutions on an individual level. And it doesn't seem like we have the solutions on a more world scale. But I think that in the same way that we can change the idea of a goal to something that is output focused and to something that is process oriented, we can change the idea of a solution into that bridge of process, that solutions might present themselves much like fermentation in ways that we never could have anticipated, that ideas, that disciplines, that microbes and different ingredients might coalesce into something we never could have imagined throughout the journey of a process, and not the imagining of a solution.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like something that like comes into my mind as you're saying that, which is like this idea of like serendipity and like spontaneity and like our goal. And I think again this is very counter to how we've we view life, the universe, and everything in under capitalism, right? Is like instead of like doing more and nose to the grindstone, like kind of this like relaxing and releasing and like allowing the things to come to you. Like not that we just like lay here like puddles and never do anything, but like that we kind of have these moments of pause and reflection and like letting ideas come in, letting inspiration strike, and then being able to like use our energy in a more focused and effective way.
Mhm.
And that's part of what like is like the hyperfixation thing. Like when you were saying that, I was like, God, that's so real. Like that's like my brain 24/7. And like
Chuck Klosterman would call it, right, Marla, the sore in your mouth that would heal if you just stopped tonguing it, right? And you're just,
right, yeah.
like you just can't stop touching
But
it
you
and fussing
can't
at
stop. Yeah, it's
it.
always there. And yeah, like and like the very interesting things that your brain comes up with to decide that like are a problem. Like are things that like are super not a problem. Like I had about a period for about 6 months where I was really worried that like part of my roof was structurally weak. It's not. My roof is totally fine. I had a roofer over who was like, "Why did you bring me out here?" But like, but I was like so worried. I was like, "My roof." And I don't
Yes.
know why. It like creaked once because like I don't know, houses do that sometimes, and it just like my brain just like went on a mission.
Oh yeah, I
And
have a lot
like
of those.
yeah.
Hmm.
And yeah, like this and so, I think there's a fine line of like recognizing when problems, like can actually be addressed and are actually problems. But like for me, that's never going to be an issue. Like it's more getting away from the hyperfixating thing. And yeah, like giving myself those reminders. Yeah, like it's it's so much better. It's so much more helpful. Like,
You
yeah.
know, I mean, we've done it's so there's been a lot that has been said in gesticulation throughout this podcast.
Uh-huh.
And you have very similar hand motions to me.
Hmm.
Anxiety feels like this to me, and I do this sometimes when I get really
Yes.
anxious.
Yes. Likewise.
Um, so it's a literal physical manifestation of that. And one of the things that I had been in discussion with another friend was how much we were holding on tight, and you did
Hmm.
this and you've talked about letting go some through the act of fermentation being a place that helped
Yeah.
teach you how to let go. And I was thinking that one of the things I wanted for this year was to let loose this clutching, this clawing,
Hmm.
this clinging. And I think that does come from a lack place of just holding on for dear life to whatever it is
Hmm.
that you makes you feel stable or grounded or like you have, and
Hmm.
to let go a little bit, and those places where we can find that ritual, that practice of letting go that maybe aren't in the very tender and hyper fixated places in our brain. I think
Hmm.
that that really gives us an opportunity to ease into what it would be to sit back and to, not totally passively, just like you said,
Mhm.
not to necessarily become a puddle, but to sit back and to let some things flow in. And one of the things I
Yeah.
noticed through reading all of your work is that creativity is a flow, and it is something that sometimes these ideas choose you, they drop
Mhm.
into you, and that to be a vessel for some of these things does require a little bit of that letting go. And so wherever you can find letting go in a practice like fermentation
Mhm.
or cooking, or I found it a lot in butchery
Yeah.
actually, um is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think, like, I sometimes teach classes on, like, fermentation for mindfulness and, like, intention setting and
Mm.
stuff, kind of as a part of this, um, and I have this dream for way in the future, for future me to do, like, kind of like multi-day something or others with fermentation that involve like kind of more intentional focusing on like somatics and movement in tandem with creation. But that's not this year because I don't have time to do it this year. But some other time I will do that. But I sometimes teach like standalone fermentation courses that focus on like mindfulness and intention setting, because I mean, like you said, like this physical aspect of creation and the way that all of our senses are engaged with this process, and like we witness change in our ferments. We
Mhm.
watch our ferments become more sour and softer, or whatever ferment we're making, whatever it's doing. And as we're making it, I think sauerkraut's very useful for this, because you're like actually massaging it and you're like feeling it get softer. Um, is very useful. So like there's this class I teach that's like a group kind of like, we all put our intentions into this like group made sauerkraut, and then like we each pot it up in our little jars and take it home, and it's like then like everybody's intentions, like we have this container we made together in this space, and then we bring home these containers and watch this transformation unfold. um and it's I feel like it's like such a good, for me, and hopefully for everybody else who comes to the classes, but certainly for me, it's a very nice balm, to a time that can feel very isolating, and like it can be hard to feel your intentions really land in the world.
Mhm.
Um,
I think it can also be hard to see transformation in ourselves, transformation in our own minds and bodies and nervous
mhm,
systems, and then transformation within our communities on a local and successively larger scale. And
mhm,
so getting to witness that this is small, like process transformation is small, it's gradual, and
mhm.
sometimes it can happen right beneath your fingers as you're massaging some cabbage. And so
Yeah,
that there is something that feels tactile. When I think transformation feels like such an esoteric or kind of diaphanous
yeah,
idea, it brings it some sense of tactility and practice, and
mm,
it's almost meditative.
yeah. And I think ties back too to that, when we talk about celebration as an anchoring in, like that celebration has more of a point in our lives than just, being a thing that like, we do because we're supposed to, but like it being a way that we actually anchor into our
Mm,
bodies an achievement, so we can mark those incremental transformations in
mm,
ourselves. I mean, just like how I check my sauerkraut every day and see how it's doing. If I didn't do that and I went to it in 2 weeks, I'd be like, hey, look, it's sauerkraut. But I would have missed that entire, like the
mm,
appreciation of process. Um, and I like having the ability to like mark that process in myself and see that
mhm.
growth.
I like that you turn this both into the tactile witnessing of transformation within sauerkraut, but you also talked about sort of the anchoring into body in terms of
Mhm.
celebration and the embodiment of that. And I know that for me, one of my biggest struggles is to anchor into my body as somebody who wants to dissociate from my body.
Uh-huh.
That anchoring and feeling something in an embodied way, that celebration isn't just something that is mental or intellectual or cerebral, but it is something
Mhm.
that is embodied in the same way that my sauerkraut is embodying transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that, and I like the phrasing you used around that too. So I think we have, I mean, we're not really trained to like connect with our bodies at all. Like especially I think as women, as queer people, as like in the many different ways that like people experience bodies, but I think people in particular who are told that there is something wrong with our bodies, or that our
Mhm,
bodies are an object,
mhm,
the body then becomes kind of a site of fear, or it can become a site of fear. And that's been what like doing somatic work this year has been so freeing, because like I recognize both the value of anchoring into like body, and like body as place, body in place, all of these wonderful
mm,
things, and really feeling that. But then it's also let me release like fear around like my body, that like I don't think I necessarily had like consciously known was there. Like a fear that my body would get sick, or a fear that
Oh,
my body is too whatever,
yeah.
right? Because as a woman, we're always too whatever.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, and I mean, for me, that fear that my body will get sick, can be pervasive.
Yeah,
Get sicker, get sick again.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
You said something about body as place, and this harkened back to, we've had so many containers and that reminder that our body is a place, that it is a container. And we talked about that some in terms of a tour bus, but
yeah,
to release fear, I think is another form of letting go
yeah.
that is not easy to do.
It's no, it's not. And like, it's a process. I mean, just like trusting yourself to deepen into a place in general, I feel like is a process. Like my house here in Atlanta, I've had a number of experiences with it that have reduced my feeling of like safety and security in it,
Mhm.
right?
Mm.
Not necessarily inside of the house, but in relation to like, my neighbor suing me because he wanted to like build a McMansion where my chicken coops were. Like stuff like
Yeah.
that like reduces my sense of feeling safe in place. And like reconnecting with place is a process, and I think, like,
Mm.
as we're talking, I'm, like, thinking about, like, that stupid neighbor, but, like, in terms of, like, the process it's taken to getting back to feeling safe
Mm.
and, like, how that process maybe applies to, like, the body as place too, like,
Mm.
it maybe is a familiar place, but, like, maybe you're scared to walk down this one path because,
Mm.
like, something happened one time, and, like, it's going to be a process to wanna walk down that path again, like, it's a process for me to wanna be in my backyard ever, and it's like, but I'm getting there, right? And, like,
Yeah.
that sort of, like, gradual reconnection with place and, like, finding the reminders of safety and comfort and, like, celebration and joy that we do have, yeah, was a theme for last year that I wasn't expecting, but, like, also will probably be one of this year.
Mm. I love that. I love place as process, body as place. And again, that reminder that process is gradual and process is also a relationship to a thing that is unfolding, that
Yeah,
is transforming under our cultivation and outside forces as well, but something that we can have some agency and to
yeah,
harken back to that sense of agency, especially when it comes to our bodies.
yeah. Yeah, and that sense of collaboration as well, I think, like, that, like, my body is my collaborator, and,
Mhm.
like, collaborations can go in any number of different directions, but, like, yeah, remembering that we're collaborating and, like, that unfolding is, like, a co-created unfolding,
Mm.
yeah, with whatever place, including body.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've put a lot into words that has really shifted little things for me in a really big way, like, just turn things around or a reframing, a reimagining of different concepts, and it's been such a gift, and I know we're running up on time, and one of the things I don't want to lose in this is, and I think that if our listeners are having the same experience that I am, right? You've taught me all these little reframes and shifts,
Mhm.
and through getting to explore your work, I had a very transformative experience about how I wanted to think about process and about craft and about containers and
Mhm.
goals and practice, just through reading your work. And so I want to dive into around ways that people can collaborate with you as a teacher and as a container for growing creative practice, because you have so many beautiful offerings. And so I don't want to miss this moment to talk about you as teacher or co-collaborator or whatever you view yourself as.
Well, thank you. So I have there's a few different ways. One, we've kind of touched a little bit on that I'm a writing coach, and the ways that that appears, I do a limited number of one-on-one sessions with people every year. I also do like completely asynchronous coaching, so they don't have to do meetings. They can just have like get my support without meetings, which is very helpful for people who are very busy. I do co-writing groups that have kind of some skill building stuff built into them.
Mm.
I even do so there's a fun thing that I offer as part of my coaching business is I do like oracle readings specifically around creative practice. And so people then receive like the reading, but then I'm like, also here's like these yoga poses and herbs and like other things that connect with this.
Mm.
They're really fun. I love doing this. And yeah, like so the coaching is one way to work with me. It's called Roots and Branches.
We'll have links to that in the show notes too.
Awesome. And then my other business, Root, I have a newsletter that I'm kind of currently reconfiguring. But will be extant in some way and is one way to like work with me and get more of my thoughts. So that is one way. I also have online classes, and I'm actually reconfiguring that space this year to to have kind of a culinary school in it rather than just like a bunch of classes. Like it's going to be a little more congealed into something called the Culinary Curiosity School.
No, I
And
love
so
that.
yeah, it's gonna be very fun. Um, but yeah, I also do kind of just like one-off things. And so I'd really encourage people if they want to work with me and they're not really sure how, or if like none of the stuff I said really resonated, or but they like want to do something. Yeah, to just like email me. My email is julia at root-kitchens.com.
We'll have that in the show notes too.
And yeah, like I'd really encourage people to reach out. Like I'm always happy to do I do everything from like doing research for like film sets and novels to like yeah, serving as an expert witness in cases to I don't know, like teaching one-off fermentation classes. Like I do all kinds of weird stuff. So like people should just reach out to me if they're like not sure what they want
I
and I
love
will
that.
help them figure it out.
I love that. I mean, it's a nod to, I think, the ways in which you weave in a lot of different interests and a lot of different crafts and practices.
Yeah,
And I love that you're leaving space for that too. I mean, that alone, I think, teaches a lot of us where that we can kind of be in all of these spaces that spark joy for us and interact within them.
absolutely.
Did I miss anything? This was one of these beautiful things where this conversation went places I didn't expect and were exactly what
Yeah.
I needed to hear. And so, I don't know, as we begin to wrap up, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything major because this conversation has been transformative for me already.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, this like I mean, I want to thank you because this is like I feel so like seen and like this is both such a fun conversation, but I feel like deeply witnessed like as a person through our interaction and through your questions. So I also want to thank you for that
Mm.
too.
Thank you. That is always my goal as an interviewer is to create a container where people can be seen for their incredible gifts because I feel so lucky to get to talk to people and I've said this a lot on the podcast but every guest absolutely changes my whole life and changes the trajectory of this podcast like it just always it takes these little turns based on the beautiful things that people say and this really reframed so much for me
Awesome.
um and I really encourage people to seek out your work. It's such a gift and it's packed full of little gifts too. I mean, you spoke about your hesitancy around marketing, which I also have, and you have a free marketing plan to kind of help vision some vision boarding things that I found, some tools that I found very useful. And so you're also building toolboxes for people and little gifts to help people unlock their own gifts, which is very beautiful. So I think they're very scalable ways to work with you as well. There's a little something for everyone.
Yeah. Well, awesome.
Perfect. This was a pleasure, and we'll have all of these in the show notes. And I think I just want to close with this reminder that we can be a bridge between the past and the lessons of the past and bringing them into the future. And that idea of the future being something that we are crafting here in collaboration and in community. I don't know if that resonates, but I just want to remind people it was really salient for me.
So, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.